Hello. We are getting ready to start a brand new unit, and this is Unit 4, which we will call phylogeny. And this particular video will focus on um, things that we'll learn in Chapter 22. So first, I want to just encourage you to read the essay at the beginning of Unit 4 in our textbook, which coincides with our Unit 4 of phylogeny. But it's a good transition from our Unit 3 of development to our Unit 4, which is phylogeny. And the interview is with Cassandra Extavor, and she is an evolutionary developmental biologist. I believe that she's at Harvard, if I remember correctly. And what is meant by developmental biology is that she and her students are studying genes that control early embryonic development, as well as the evolutionary origin of these genes and how their functions have changed over time. And one of the questions that is asked, and there are only like three, so it's not a long thing to read, but one thing she's asked is this question here. Much of your research has been on Evo-Devo. Say more about what that means. So she responds, Evo-Devo stands for evolutionary developmental biology. Scientists in this field try to understand the difference in development between, let's say, a coconut and a rose. They're both plants, they both make seeds, they both make pollen, so there's a lot of similarities, but they don't look the same at all. Why is that? Or the fact that when you compare the development of a monkey and a human, you can't detect many differences in their embryos or their genes. How can they be similar in so many ways and yet end up as such different organisms? So she does a nice job of encapsulating the kinds of questions that we ask. So the central question that we're going to be thinking about in this next unit is what causes the similarities and differences among Earth's many different species. And at the beginning of chapter 22, we have this picture of an orchid, and you can see the orchid on the left here. This is the orchid, and this right here is an orchid mantis. And so it may not look too much like the praying mantises that you're used to seeing or seeing pictures of, but this is a type of mantis, and it looks very, very similar as this orchid flower. And it kind of hangs out here and waits for pollinators to come and try to get nectar and pollen from this orchid flower, and then it eats those pollinators. So it's got this camouflage that enables it to be a great predator. So the question again is what causes the similarities and differences between these two mantises? So they both have kind of this triangular head, and they both have kind of this long body, and they both have head, thorax, and abdomen, and three pairs of legs. But and these long antennas, which you can kind of see up here, but they're very different. They're different in color, and the shapes of their legs are different, and the shape of the abdomen is different. So, what causes those similarities and differences? And there are other observations about life that scientists have been trying to answer for hundreds of years, literally. Um, One observation is that organisms are well suited for life in their environments. And you could say that both of the types of mantises that we saw in the previous slide are well suited for life in their environments. The one on the left, the green one, probably lives in vegetation that is green and it hides itself in the vegetation. And then when when it finds another insect, it can eat that insect. So it's camouflaged in the environment that it lives in. And similarly, this orchid mantis is camouflaged for its environment. So organisms are well suited for life in their environments. And there are lots of shared characteristics among organisms, and I'll give you lots of examples of those in the next couple of videos. Lots of similarities among living things, but also there's a huge diversity amongst living things. The mantis is very different from a person, and it's very different from that orchid that it lives on. And so there's just a huge diversity of life. And so, what I would like to suggest to you is that one explanation for all of these observations is the idea of descent with modification, which led to our modern theory of evolution. So, evolution is one explanation for these observations and many other observations about life. And so, here is a diagram from the beginning of chapter 22 that shows the idea of an ancient mantis ancestor, and then that this species has diverged into different descendant species, each of them adapted to a different kind of environment. And so these present day species of mantis that we see here have descended from a common ancestor, but each of them has been modified from that ancient common ancestor by the process. They've accumulated differences from this ancestor. And so we say that descent with modification has led to both the unity and the diversity of life, both similarities in all of these mantises, but also differences amongst them. So both the unity and diversity can be explained by the idea of descent with modification. Now, this idea came from a guy you've probably heard of, Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin was born in 1809 on the same day that Abraham Lincoln was born, on the exact same day that Abraham Lincoln was born. And Darwin came from a well-to-do family, so his background was very different than Lincoln's background. You all know the sort of mythology surrounding Abraham Lincoln, that he grew up in a log cabin and learned to read by the light of the fire, and came from a pretty humble background. Charles Darwin was born into a much more privileged background. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a physician and was a natural philosopher. In other words, he thought about nature and um, thought about how it could have come to be the way it is. He was an abolitionist. He was definitely against slavery, and he was a poet. And Charles Darwin's father was also a physician. And so when Darwin was, oh, and there's a picture of Erasmus Darwin, grandfather. And so when Charles Darwin was thinking about what he wanted to do in life, his father encouraged him, probably quite strongly, to also go to medical school. And so he started out his education at the University of Edinburgh. And it turned out that medicine was not a good fit for him. And so some of you may be thinking that medicine is what you want to do, and others of you may be thinking, um, maybe I used to think that medicine was my thing, but I've changed my mind. And that was Darwin. At the time he was studying medicine, they were doing surgeries, but they didn't use anesthesia, and he just had a really hard time. He just found it really barbaric that people would be operated on without any anesthesia. I find that kind of barbaric too. Anyway, so then he transitioned into studying theology. And he was also extremely interested in natural history. In other words, he was interested in nature, interested in plants and animals. And he had a mentor at uh, the University of Cambridge, whose name was John Henslow, who really encouraged him in his pursuit of natural history. And Darwin really wanted to end up with getting a church, getting a position at a church in the countryside where he could devote a lot of his time to studying the nature around him. But about the time that he was finishing up his formal education, he had the chance to serve as a naturalist aboard a ship that was going on an around the world voyage. And I don't think he knew quite what he was getting into when he signed off on this, but he was he served at as a naturalist, and he also served as a companion for the captain because the captain came from a different social class than the people who were the crew on the ship, and so he wanted somebody that he could have dinner with and converse with and not have to not be able to kind of keep himself separate from the men. So anyway, and when I say Darwin may not have known what he was getting into, it was this voyage lasted 5 years, and he may have thought it was going to be more like a 1 or 2 year trip. So we have this figure in our book that shows the timeline of Darwin and kind of fits him into what else was going on scientifically when he was alive. And so I'll mention Hutton later and Lyell and Cuvier and Lamarck. I kind of skipped Malthus, but Malthus wrote an important essay on the principle of population, so maybe I'll refer to it later when we get there. Um, and these scientists were publishing their works around the time that Darwin was born. So Lamarck published his hypothesis of evolution in 1809. Hutton was a geologist, and he published his Principles of Gradualism in 1795. Lyell published a work on geology shortly before Darwin traveled on the Beagle, and you can see that 5 year period right here. And so one of the books that Darwin took along with him was the Principles of Geology, and he spent time reading it and studying it while he was on his voyage. And Cuvier was also doing his work on studying fossils around this time. So um, the the ideas around evolution were sort of being discussed at the time that Darwin was alive and was working. And then you see here in 1859 when Darwin published his most famous work, The Origin of Species. So I'm going to back up a little bit and talk in time anyway, and talk about the classification of species. This is another big topic that was being discussed at the time that Darwin was alive. And this goes all the way back to Aristotle before the time of Christ, who came up with the idea of the scala naturae. And Aristotle held to the fixity of species. He believed that species had been created, and species were not changing over time, and that you could put each species on its own rung of a ladder, which he called the scale of nature, or the ladder of nature, and that species couldn't move along this ladder of nature. And of course, humans are at the top, and I suppose worms are at the bottom, or whatever. And Aristotle's ideas were generally consistent with the account of creation that we find in Genesis, that God created the organisms. And many people to this day believe that the organisms that God created are still the same today as they were then. And Carolus Linnaeus, you've probably heard of his name. He was an extremely influential taxonomist, and he developed a classification scheme based on that fixity of species and based on the idea of similarities in organisms. And so his scheme is based on nested groups. And so I'll show you a picture of his scheme, which is shown right here, and the idea of these nested groups. So if we think about a leopard, which is shown up here in the top, a leopard is in the genus, its species name is Panthera pardus, and so it's in the genus Panthera, and there are other species with the same genus name that would be very closely related to this leopard. And then the leopards and the lions and the tigers and your house cats are all in the family Felidae, which is the cat family. So these little yellow circles represent the other um, the other members of this family. And then the cat family and other families like the dog family and the bear family are all in the carnivore order Carnivora. And then this order, the carnivore order, is in a larger group called a class with other orders of mammals, like the rodent order, for example. And so we just continue on down to the domains, and you likely are aware that there are three domains. Within domain Eukarya are the kingdoms, plants, animals, fungi, and within the animal kingdom, there are many phyla, and one of those phyla is the chordates, which includes all the vertebrates, and there are many vertebrates, and one class of vertebrates are the mammals. So Linnaeus had the idea of these nested groups, and he conceived of the similarities in these organisms as being based on the pattern of creation. However, the idea that species are changeable or mutable was being debated when Darwin was alive. It was kind of in the intellectual air, you might say. So this was a topic of conversation when Darwin was maybe sitting around the dinner table with his grandfather, who was kind of thinking about these things. And his grandfather wrote poems that suggested that animals were changing, that not just animals, but organisms were changing over time. And so this was kind of something that was being debated and discussed. And Darwin eventually came to believe that classification of animals and plants should be based not on just similarity in the way they were created, but on evolutionary relationships based on who they descended from. And so again, here's the Linnaeus scheme, and then here's Darwin's sketch that he drew in his notebooks after he came back from his voyage around the world. He um, started doing a notebook, and he was trying to pull together all his thoughts about how he thought life had come to be. And he drew this tree that shows a cluster of organisms in the B group and another in the D group and another in the C group and another branch called the A group. And number one here was, I think, what he thought of as the ancestral, and then that these groups had descended with modification from this original ancestor. So Darwin's ideas came to be known as, he didn't use the word evolution in his book, but we now talk about his ideas as the theory of evolution. So I think we should start out with some definitions of evolution to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. And evolution can be tricky because many people use the word to mean different things. And so I think we should be clear about what we mean when we say evolution. There are two definitions that we will use. The first is what Darwin called it. So the idea of descent with modification, the idea that current organisms on Earth today are descended with modification from organisms that used to be alive. And another definition that is more part of what we call the modern synthesis of evolution is that evolution can be defined as a change in the genetic composition of a population from generation to generation. And these two definitions are not opposing each other. I would just say that the second definition is more specific and can is more like a specific measurement of how we know a population has evolved. Now, evolution, no matter how we define it, can be thought of in two different ways. Evolution can be thought of as a pattern of observations. And our book makes the claim that observations of the natural world suggest that life has evolved over time. And we'll look at some of these arguments in this video and the next one to come. And then also evolution can be thought of as a process, the mechanisms that cause the pattern of change over time. And we'll talk about this briefly in this video, and in chapter 23, there we'll delve more deeply into the mechanisms of evolution, how it is that life can change over time. So again, evolution is one explanation for a lot of observations that we make of nature. So let's talk about some of the observations that suggest that evolution has happened, or observations that were influential in Darwin's thinking. So first of all, observations from geology. So geology can be defined as the science that deals with the history of the Earth and its life, especially as recorded in rocks. So if you take a geology course, and I hope you do, geology is quite interesting. I actually have never taken a formal geology class, but I'm probably the poorer for that intellectually. Anyway, geology is all about studying the rocks and what we can learn about the Earth from studying the rocks. And so rocks, it turns out, comes in layers or strata. The word stratum just means a layer. And we specifically can talk about geological strata being layers of rock. And then the other thing that, so we can learn from a couple of different things when we study rocks. We can study different kinds of rocks that are laid down in different layers, and those layers tell us something about the history of the Earth. And we also find remnants of past organisms in those rocks. And those remnants of past organisms are called fossils, remains or traces of organisms from the past. So let's look at a figure from our textbook that illustrates both of these things. The the layers in rocks are thought to be laid down as a process of sedimentation. So most layers in the rocks form underneath a body of water, and sediments settle out from the body of water and settle to the bottom. And they form different layers of rocks depending on what kind of dust is in the lake, and depending probably on what runs off from the water that's feeding into the lake or the sea or the ocean. And so the climatic features that are in place can affect the sediments. And yeah, just the kind of other rock that's being worn and put into the sediments. And then later, with some geologic uplift, this rock may come to the surface, and then there may be erosion that exposes these layers. So the common example of this is the Grand Canyon. And there's a river at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's the Colorado River. And geologists think that that river has been slowly eroding its way through the rock. And so there are many layers in the rock. And if you go visit the Grand Canyon, and I hope you do if you haven't ever done that, you can clearly see these different layers in the rock. And at different layers, you find different kinds of rock or different kinds of fossils. So the fossils that you might find down here are different from the fossils that you find up here. And we consider the layers at the top to be younger, having been laid down at a later time. So you have to put down the lower layers before you can put the layers on top. So the layers, the deeper layers are older, and the younger layer or the more shallow layers, the layers that are closer to the surface are the younger ones. And so we also think that fossils that are in deeper layers are older than fossils that are in layers closer to the surface. So the science of studying fossils is called paleontology. And so here's where I'm going to mention some of the people who are on that figure from earlier in the slideshow. These are people who studied fossils and came to different conclusions about what they saw. So Georges Cuvier was studying fossils in Europe, and he noticed that fossils in the deeper strata, the deeper layers of rock, are less similar to current day living organisms than the fossils that are closer to surface. And so he he was a proponent of the fixity of species. He did not think that species could change over time. And so he attributed the differences in the fossils to certain things going extinct. And so he apparently thought that there used to be a lot more living things on Earth than we have now, and many of them went extinct, and that's why we no longer have living things that look like some of the oldest fossils. And he also noticed that there were distinct boundaries, and you can see that in this picture. There are distinct boundaries between certain layers in the rocks, and he attributed those boundaries to catastrophes, such as a global flood, um, as described in the book of Genesis. James Hutton was a contemporary of Georges Cuvier. You can see that he was born before Cuvier and he died after Cuvier died. So goodness, that can't be correct. I must have put down um, the wrong number there. I will correct that later. I will look that up. But anyway, they overlapped. I can't imagine that he lived to be 150 years old. But I think I just miscopied. Anyway, Hutton came up with the idea that gradual mechanisms formed the features that we have on Earth rather than these these catastrophes forming the features that we have. And then Charles Lyell um, he's the one who died in 1875, and he was a student of Hutton's, and he modified Hutton's ideas into the idea of uniformitarianism, that the same processes that formed the earth way back when are also the ones that are operating today. So we can study processes that are happening today and get an idea about the processes that shaped the earth back then. These ideas from the paleontologists and geologists were very influential in Darwin's thinking, and these two geologists, Hutton and Lyell, based on what they were saying, it was clear to Darwin, and also based on the observations that he was making as he was traveling on the Beagle, that the Earth was really quite old, not not really young like some people were saying. And by young and old, um, I would say young would be, say, 10,000 years old, 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Old would be like millions or billions of years. So very, very old. Okay, also making contributions at the time of Darwin was, or prior to Darwin, really, was Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And he was the first scientist. He was not the first scientist to come up with the idea that species have changed, but he was the first person who proposed a mechanism for how that could have happened. The mechanism that he proposed has since been discredited, and but still, he was influential in that he came up with the idea, or he wrote down a lot of important things about his observations of fossils. And so he noticed that there were chronological series of fossils in the rocks. So, um, so changes in fossils as you go through different layers of rocks, and that these chronological series suggested lines of descent. And so he was a proponent that organisms had changed over time and that that was documented in the fossil record. The mechanism that he suggested was the idea of use and disuse, the idea that parts that are used by an organism become larger and stronger, and that parts that are not used tend to diminish and eventually go away. And he also believed that an organism could acquire characteristics during its life and then pass those characteristics on to its offspring. So, for example, a giraffe that is trying to reach some leaves that are above it on a tree can stretch its neck. And by stretching its neck, it could maybe lengthen its neck. And also, if it developed a longer neck, that longer neck would be passed on to its environment. Now, from what we've learned about genetics in the last 150 years, we now know that it's not true, that you don't pass on acquired characteristics. And so these mechanisms have been discredited, but Lamarck was still influential in that he proposed that organisms had evolved. So let's talk about the voyage of the Beagle because this was another very influential episode in Darwin's life. And so Darwin on the Beagle, um, here's a map of their trip. They left from England and they sailed, stopped at an island here in the Northern Pacific, and then oops, I'm sorry, following the wrong arrow here. They traveled down to South America. The main purpose of this trip was to map the coast of South America. And so they spent a lot of time going back and forth between Brazil and Argentina. And while the ship was doing its mapping, Darwin spent a lot of time on land. He struggled with seasickness, and so he preferred being on land whenever he could be. And he made um, copious collections. He collected all kinds of plants and animals, insects, both living animals and mostly dead animals, and he would ship his specimens back to England periodically. Eventually, they rounded the southern end of South America and spent some time along the coast of the west coast of South America, modern day Chile, and then made their way up past Peru and finally to Ecuador, and then went west. And before they headed across the Pacific, they stopped for a week or so at the Galapagos Islands. And here's an expanded view of the Galapagos Islands. And the time that Darwin spent in the Galapagos was also extremely um, influential to his thinking. So here were some of the things that he was observing while he was on this trip. He observed that organisms were well suited to their environments, and we had already noted this earlier in our lecture. He noticed that plants and animals in temperate parts of South America were more similar to organisms in tropical parts of South America than they were to organisms that lived in temperate regions of Europe. So this made him ponder if the source of organisms on the earth was that God made them and put them in the places where they were, why wouldn't he put similar species in all the cold areas all over the world and different species in the tropical areas of the world? But what he observed instead is that organisms are more similar to organisms that they live close to, even if they live in very different parts, in very different climates. So the southern tip of South America is quite temperate. It's much colder. It's a long ways from the equator. So there's temperate climates down here, and you might expect that if this is about as far from the equator as Britain is from the equator, you might expect the plants and animals down here to be similar to the plants and animals up here because they're similar in climate. But instead, these animals had much more affinity to other animals that he found in tropical areas than animals and plants that were in Europe. Um, and also in his study of all the fossils that he found in South America, he found that they resembled species that were currently living in South America. He also experienced an earthquake and noticed after the earthquake that some rocks had been thrust upward several meters. And so he got a sense that geological processes were still shaping the earth, still at work shaping the earth. And then finally, the Galapagos, one of the most remarkable things he said that he noticed, and I'll just read you what he said later when he wrote his book about the voyage of the Beagle. He wrote this kind of at the end of his chapter on the Galapagos. He wrote, "I have not as yet noticed by far the most remarkable feature in the natural history of this archipelago. It is that the different islands to a considerable extent are inhabited by a different set of beings." And he said, "I never dreamed that islands about 50 or 60 miles apart, and most of them inside of each other, formed of precisely the same rocks, placed under quite similar climate, rising to a nearly equal height, would have been differently tenanted. But we shall see that this is the case." And so this was the most amazing thing to him, or the most striking thing to him about the Galapagos, is that there was a different collection of plants and animals on different islands. So the finch species on, say, let's see if we go back to, well, if I can get my slideshow to go back. So the species of finches on San Cristobal Island were different than the species of finches on Santa Cruz and on Isabela. And the marine iguanas were different in different parts of the archipelago, and the tortoises were different from different islands. So that was quite remarkable to him. So eventually, when he came back, and it took him about 20 years of studying and gathering his information, but he eventually published his book called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And you can see that the subtitle there is The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. And he was quite interested in adaptations, the idea that individuals, that animals and plants have inherited characteristics that enhance their survival or reproduction. And these inherited characteristics that help organisms survive and reproduce can be called adaptations. And then he came up with the idea of natural selection. So this was one of his big contributions. Two big contributions. One is the idea of descent with modification. The second big contribution was the idea of natural selection, that individuals with certain inherited traits tend to survive and reproduce at higher rates than do individuals that lack those traits, so that the traits that they have affect their ability to survive and reproduce. And he compared this to artificial selection, which is when humans modify species by selective breeding. And so he reasoned that if we can take a wild species like wild mustard and we can go through a few generations of selective breeding and produce several different kinds of vegetables that we can eat based on what we select, which individuals we select to breed with each other, then maybe over a longer period of time, a single species of finch that made its way out to the Galapagos could, over many generations, maybe hundreds of years instead of maybe just a few generations, could diverge into the different kinds of finches that he observed in the Galapagos. And we could even extrapolate. So I don't think he wrote anything about elephants, but here's another figure from your textbook that shows um, divergence from a common ancestor of a bunch of different kinds of animals, including modern day manatees and hyraxes, which are related, the most closely related mammals to modern day elephants. And so this would be over millions of years rather than over hundreds of years. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video here and we'll pick up. This has gotten to be kind of a long video, but we will pick up here in our next video.